Today I'll be reviewing this book. It's the Tolle Lege Press 1599 Geneva Bible reproduction. It came in a little slipcase, which I'm showing you here. It's recommendations. It came with a CD, which I'm sure if I searched the house I could find. Recommendation by D. James Kennedy, George Grant. And it talks about the special features. An introduction by Gary DeMar. Here is the ISBN at the bottom. ISBN 10 is up higher. And the book itself is 9.5 inches tall, 6 3/8 inches wide, and 1.5 inches thick. And for size comparison, I have here to start the Hendrickson 1560 facsimile. So the facsimile is in the older original typeset, whereas the one on top is in a modern typeset. And you can see they've shrunk it considerably. I have also here my 1599 reproduction of the Geneva Bible. This is also a facsimile, so it has the older typeset. The book on the bottom is the second book I reviewed. So if you look back in my stream, the very second video that appears is a review of that lower Bible. And so the original 1599 is much larger than the modern Tolle Lege Press one. In fact, the book is about the same size as the the ESB Thinline Reference Bible. In fact, the Thinline is a little bit thinner, but otherwise they're quite comparable in dimensions. So it's in modern type. Let's take a look at it. The book is laid out in 2 columns, and it's in verse-by-verse format. Each of these columns is about 59 millimeters wide, and I count about 53 characters per line. There can be as many as 54 lines per page. A few less than that here because of all the notes on this particular page. Page dimensions are 234 millimeters tall, that's 9.2 inches tall, 157 millimeters wide, that's 6.2 inches wide. The characters appear to be printed in very dark black ink, at least usually. As we see here, seems like a quite dark ink. Margins at the top, from this line to the top, 15 millimeters. At the bottom is 6 to 7 millimeters. The inner margin here can be as much as 10 millimeters. The outer margin is right at 10 millimeters there, so that's like 2/5 of an inch. The font here is advertised as an 8-point font. I measured it against Times New Roman, and the uppercase letters look to be about 9 points tall, but the lowercase letters are only about 7.5 points tall. That's the opposite of your typical Bible font. Typically the Bible font will have the uppercase letters like that T smaller and the lowercase letters larger to give you the overall impression of a larger font. They did it exactly the opposite here. The line height is about 3.74 millimeters line to line. That's about 10.6 points. So you have essentially a 8-ish point font in a 10.6 line spacing. So line spacing should look pretty good to you, and it does to me. Verse numbers are, as is typical in a verse-by-verse Bible, at the left edge of the pages. The text is not line matched. I think you should be able to see that quite easily here. If you look here, that line of text that you can see through the paper is offset from this line here. You can see quite a lot of text through the paper. It's not that opaque. References are in the center column. They're somewhat sparse, but you can find them here and there. They are in about a 5.5 point sans serif font. The notes at the page bottom are somewhat larger. They're at about in about an 8 point sans serif font. The paper sheet thickness I measured to be 38 micrometers, which I estimate a paper weight at about 35 grams per square meter. I think the surface of the paper is fairly matte. There's a bit of glare off it, but none of that shiny, waxy look. There is, as we just mentioned, significant show-through. You can read through the paper. It's here at my thumb. It's a white paper. There's some print non-uniformity, and you see it right away as you come into the Bible. Let's just look here at the beginning of Genesis, and I'll show you page 4 on the left and page 5 on the right. Notice how much darker the left is than the right. That is not unusual in this Bible. It's fairly common. The books of the Bible have no introductions. Book titles are in the upper outside of the pages, as are the page contents. So the first verse on the left-hand page is here. The last verse on the right-hand page is there. Page numbers, as you saw, are at the center top of the page. There are no headings in the text. Instead of headings, we have the old style chapter summaries. Chapter summaries, as here, are in an italic font with capitals about 7.5 points tall. The chapters are easy to find because the chapter numbers are, as here, in a large, bold numeral. Books of the Bible do begin on a separate page, so let's go to the back and show you some of the smaller books. Here's 1 Peter, here's Jude, 3 John, 2 John. They're all beginning on their own separate pages. Words of Christ are in black, quite happily. There are none of those bright pink letters to burn into my retina. Words added for clarity by the translator are in italics. So here we're looking at Mark 9:26, and we find italic words in the text. So those are supplied by the translator for readability. At the back of the book, after Revelation, the Tolle Lege Press edition does provide some helps. Let's find the end of Revelation. Okay, we're getting close. Here we are. So, at the end of Revelation, after the last book of the Bible, there is a form of prayer to be used in private houses every morning and evening. It is in 6 pages, double column format, paragraph format, and it uses the same font as the font that's in the Bible itself. That's followed by a glossary of terms, and it is quite useful. It has words like ab-alienate, which means to estrange. I think you could have guessed that pretty easily. Several pages here. The glossary is in fact 20 pages long. It's about 10.5 point font. And at the end of it, we have 20 pages of unlined Bible paper and 5 pages of a heavy cardstock. There's no concordance, there are no maps, there's no map index, there's no gilt on the page edges, no ribbon marker. This is a simple hardback. There are red and yellow head and tail bands, as you see there. Quite attractive. It's smooth. It's not a nice cloth hardback. It's that slick, smooth stuff. I prefer cloth. It's a nice little design here, but there's no embossing. The binding is sewn. It does lie open and very nearly flat. Let's open it to Genesis. As you see, there's a little bit of a curl here, but you can certainly read this. You can read it without holding it open with a hand, so there's no reason to use a book stand here with this book. When we come in from the other end, from the front of the Bible, we have a typical hardback binding, cardstock, several pages. It's 4 there before you get to a family register. This is a slick, heavy paper. Page for marriages. Place for births and deaths. First title page, which is the only title page in this particular Bible. Tolle Lege Press, Whitehall, West Virginia, in the United States of America. Copyright page. This particular edition is copyright Tolle Lege Press, 2006-2007. They distribute it. Here are the ISBNs for the hardcover, the genuine leather black, and the deluxe genuine leather limited edition in tan. I know they've done many editions since these. Printed in the United States of America. Mine is the 4th printing in 2007. We have the table of contents, has a foreword, advisory board, preface, note to the modern reader, history of the Geneva Bible by Dr. Marshall Foster, instructions, prayers, and title pages, books of the New Testament, Old Testament, New Testament. Old Testament begins on page 1, New Testament on page 947. And look at what's printed on the opposite page. It's just very easy to read there. It really does show through this paper quite easily. And so here's the foreword. And I will pan up it so you can freeze this and read it if you like. I'll try to get it horizontal. Notice that I have a tendency to tilt the book in the videos. These are people who were on the Geneva Bible restoration project. A blank page. This is the preface. They say their source text was a particular copy of the 1599, and so if you have a 1599, this edition may vary from that because there were some printing distinctives between the different copies. So that's that. Here's a note to the modern reader. By Gary DeMar. The history of the Geneva Bible. We showed a couple of charts on the history at the very beginning. Essentially it's made by exiles from the persecution of Mary Tudor, who was the Mary who succeeded the boy king Edward. And New Testament was printed in 1557. The entire Bible first printed in 1560. The edition that we're looking at here is a 1599 edition. This is from the original to the Christian reader. So this is the Geneva Bible translator's preface to the reader. There is a little note on the incomparable treasure of the Holy Scriptures with a prayer for the use of the same, the true use of the same. And how to profit in reading the Holy Scriptures. And then a woodcut This is a reproduction of the woodcut cut from the original 1599. It has the 12 apostles, 12 tribes of Israel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Another page. The crossing of the Red Sea, I believe, here. And you can see that it is printed with the old style S's. This is about the only place you'll find them in this edition. Books of the Old and New Testament. This is in their order of appearance. You come to the Old Testament, and as you can see, it's very easy to read. The first book of Moses, called Genesis, right through the first page. Then you're at Genesis. At this point, I'd like to do a few font comparisons, and to start, I have the 1599 facsimile Geneva Bible on a stand, and I'm going to bring the Tolle Lege Press 1599 over the top. You can see how small the font in the original was. Somewhat difficult to read. Here is the same verse beside it in the Tolle Lege Press. I'm looking at moreover God in both, and it is much easier to read in the somewhat smallish 8-point font to the right, but much easier than in the original. Same verse. This is the Hendrickson 1560 facsimile, and they've blown up the font somewhat for readability here, so this is much larger than the original 1560 font was. We'll bring in the Tolle Lege Press book at about the same point again. So here the fonts are comparable in size. In fact, the 1560 seems to be just a bit larger. I also prefer the 1560's heavy paper with very little show-through, and the fact that they used that cream or off-white color. Those things do aid in readability. The Tolle Lege Press edition does have an advantage in having better line spacing, and of course the modern typeface is easier to read. Now I have the Tolle Lege Press 1599 Geneva Bible up on a stand, just to show you some of the features of the typeface. First, you can see the line spacing is really quite excellent. It's very easy on the eye. The column is not too wide for me. I prefer a narrow column. This is somewhat wide, but it's acceptable. Line spacing is good. The tracking, the character spacing, appears adequate to me as well. It's not so close that it causes me any kind of trouble. The greatest issue I have with this is the show-through, the ghosting from the opposite side of the page. That and the fact that it's not line matched creates kind of a cluttered, noisy environment for the eye and the brain to read in. But otherwise it seems quite nice. I think a Bible-style font with a smaller capital and a larger, smaller letter would have worked a little bit better. We could have increased the size of those lowercase letters and left the uppercase letter at that size. I think it would have been quite nice. Here is another 8-point font. This is the Oxford Brevier Blackface coming into the right from a little bit later in the same chapter in Genesis. And I think the font on the right is superior in most ways. The fact that it's darker and bolder makes it easier to read. The only real advantage to the font on the left, to my way of thinking, is that it has better line spacing. But otherwise I give the nod to the Oxford font on the right. Sometimes people are faced with the question of whether they want to get the 1560 or the 1599 Geneva Bible. This is the 1560 Hendrickson reproduction that we're looking at Romans 1:18. And two things change between 1560 and 1599. The most dramatic of which is that the notes, the side notes in the modern edition, the footnotes, are changed. And I think they're more voluminous, fuller, more detailed in the 1599 than they are in the 1560. You're looking here at the Hendrickson 1560. Oh, I said two things. The second thing that changes is that the translation itself changes slightly, and we'll look at some of the translation changes in just a moment. But let's look at some of the differences in the footnotes just by sampling here at Romans 1:18. You're looking at 1560 Hendrickson, and it has, at verse 1:18, it has two footnotes, one at ungodliness, and one at truth and unrighteousness. If we look at the 1599, at verse 18, you see three footnotes there in verse 18. So you have one more footnote. And if we read the footnotes, so we have a footnote S and a note T. We go over to the side column, and we see those. For S, it says, he divided the law of nature, corrupt, into ungodliness and unrighteousness. Ungodliness containeth the false worshipping of God, unrighteousness, breach of love toward man. And then the second note, T, which is at truth and unrighteousness, is in that they neither worship God, as nature partly teacheth them, nor love one another. Now if we look at the notes in the modern edition, we have three here, and I will just let you read those to yourself. But you do have more text, so the footnotes are changed. They're more in depth and certainly distinct. I'd like to also point out that they're much easier to read here in the modern edition of the 1599 than they were in the original. So if I can manage it, I'm going to bring the original over and hold it up to the camera and show you what those look like at verse 1:18. So here they are. Here's 1:18. You have an 8. You have an A, which would have been footnote 2 in the modern 1599, and a B. You go over into the side, you find 8 here. Another consideration of that principal question, all men being considered in themselves or without Christ are guilty both of godliness. You know, you may have noticed that they had ungodliness in brackets in the modern edition, so they've corrected that. Tolle Lege Press has taken godliness and corrected it to ungodliness, and also unrighteousness, and therefore subject to condemnation. Therefore must they needs seek righteousness in some other. Then the two other notes, against all kinds of ungodliness, and by truth Paul meaneth all the light that is left in man since his fall, not as though they being led thereby were able to come into favor with God, but that their own reason might condemn them of wickedness, both against God and men. In that last segment I mentioned that in addition to the note changes, there were some significant translation changes. And what I did is I read through the book of Romans with the 1560 and the 1599 side by side and made a few charts to mark the differences. So the first one I found is at Romans, we'll get there in just a second, Romans chapter 1, verse 12. And see how it reads at the end of verse 12. That you might be strengthened. Well, the earlier 1560 edition read, to strengthen you. So that's just the first example. I'm not going to talk to the charts. I'm just going to show them. And I'll let you pause and read them, or just let them flow by as you please. Let me say that I think that perhaps the most significant of those changes is at Romans 5:12 here, and the ending in the 1599 reads, in whom all men have sinned, but in the 1560 that read, for as much as all men have sinned. I think the modern scholars will tell you that the 1560 rendering is more accurate. Now, if you decide to go with the Tolle Lege Press reproduction in modern print, you do miss some things out of the back of the Bible. So I just wanted to show you those here in my 1599 facsimile. It starts here with a brief table of the interpretation of proper names that are chiefly found in the Old Testament. And that goes for several pages. And then there's this table of principal things contained in the Bible after the order of the alphabet, which is sort of like a mini concordance. That is not in the Tolle Lege Press edition. Thirdly, we have metrical psalms by Sternhold and Hopkins. This is multiple pages of material here that is not in the Tolle Lege Press edition. I haven't counted them recently, but as you can see, it's quite a lot of material that was in the original 1599, which has been excised from the Tolle Lege Press edition. In fact, they have other material after the Psalms. There's the Creed, the Lord's Prayer, prayer to the Holy Ghost, and then you come to a form of prayer to be used in private houses every morning and evening. This is in the Tolle Lege Press edition, so you do retain all of this material here. But you've lost the Psalms. And then at the very end you find here in the original a table for the number of the whole Psalms, and also in which leaf you may find every one of them. So it's kind of a table of contents for that metrical Psalms section. And that is missing from the Tolle Lege Press edition. But of course in the Tolle Lege Press edition with the modern typeface you also get a glossary, which you do not have here in the facsimile. I wanted also to show you the quality of the reproduction here. I hope that's coming across in camera, but this is very crisp and sharp on the right. And this is hazy and fuzzy here on the left. I think we see the same thing here on the next page with this little inset woodcut. The modern reproduction simply isn't as good as the original. You can see a lot more detail in the right than you can on the left. Sometimes people these days express anxiety about the number of different translations or about changes in their favorite translation. And I demonstrated earlier that the Geneva Bible between 1560 and 1599 was actually somewhat fluid itself. And although you didn't have the number of translations than you do now, at one point in the early 1600s you could have chosen between the Geneva Bible, the Bishop's Bible, and the King James Version. Another thing that's changing these days is the Greek text behind the New Testament. In those days, it was pretty fluid as well. They didn't have this concept that we had something called the Textus Receptus, which was uniform and unchanging. New editions of what later became called the Textus Receptus were being produced with some rapidity. I have us here at one of James White's favorite passages, Revelation 16:5, in the 1599 Geneva Bible, where it reads, "And I heard the angel of the waters say, Lord, thou art just, which art, and which wast, and holy, because thou hast judged these things." Now, the King James Bible, which is based on Zay's 1598, at least they're taking that reading from 16:5 from a 1598 Greek New Testament. It says, "which art and wast and shalt be." But the 1599 Geneva Bible is based on different editions of the Textus Receptus, which read, "and holy" at that point. So we may have had a period of time from maybe the 1640s through the middle of the 1800s where things were relatively unchanging, where New Testaments were popping up every few years, and the single translation that most people used in English was fairly steady, unchanging. These days actually seem to me to be sort of a return to the Reformation era, when you had new translations of the Bible being developed and new Greek New Testaments coming out every few years. As a follow-up to that last segment, I want to show you George Rickerberry's interlinear Greek New Testament at Revelation 16:5, which says, "the one who is, and the one who was, and the Holy One." Rickerberry is presenting Stephanus 1550, so this is one edition of the Textus Receptus. Berry also indicates in footnotes how Elzevir 1624 differs from Stephanus 1550, and in this case the only footnote here has to do with the chi and the article. It has nothing to do with Holy One. I can show you that here. And Berry used the capital E for Elzevir, and there's no reference to Elzevir. So we can safely conclude that Stephanus 1550 and Elzevir 1624, two editions of the Textus Receptus, both agree with the Geneva Bible here and have holy and not he who is to come. Now, for the summary, I really like what Tolle Lege Press has done with the 1599 Geneva Bible. The original, or a facsimile that you can get, is somewhat hard to read. It's a tiny print. It's in the older characters. They break words at places that we modern people would not break them. And this is an easily readable, although somewhat small font. And it makes everything very clear, quite accessible. The footnotes are now in a nice order, arranged in characters where words do not break in odd ways. So I like all those things about it. Now, what do I dislike? I dislike the paper that they chose. I don't like very, very white paper like this as much as an off-white. I do not like the show-through. I don't know why the volume has to be this skinny, why we couldn't have used thicker paper in it. And then, although the line spacing I think is quite good, I think we could have gone with a somewhat larger font, at least for those lowercase characters, which are really quite tiny, at about a 7.5 point font. Also, that concludes my summary of the Tolle Lege Press 1599 edition. I hope you've enjoyed it, and if you have, please remember to hit the like button. And if you haven't already done so and feel so inclined, I certainly encourage you to subscribe to the channel. Thanks very much for watching.